When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Knowing you could be saving money for the things you really want is a great feeling. Talk to a State Farm agent today to learn how you can choose to bundle and save with the Personal Price Plan. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. This is the second of our three-part Seat at the Table episode on John Quincy Adams. If for some reason you haven't listened to part 1 yet, you are highly encouraged to listen to it first, as we examine John Quincy's life from his birth on up to when he was getting ready to become U.S. Minister to Russia in 1809. He certainly had an eventful time in his first couple of forays to Europe, and we'll find out how this next journey to the continent goes on this episode. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to say a special thanks to Ilse and Chris of the Flat Pack History of Sweden and Kingdom podcast. On the former, they are examining Swedish history from its prehistoric beginnings on up to the present day. This led them to launch the second podcast, Kingdom, which looks at the Swedish monarchs and evaluates them in a Rexipod format. The stakes are high for the monarchs, however, as the ones who don't measure up can get squished into a meatball. You can find a Flat Pack History of Sweden and Kingdom anywhere you get your podcast, or you can go to their website, a flatpackhistoryofsweden.com, all one word. I'll have a link on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. Elsa and Chris are not only amazing podcasters, but wonderful friends, so please be sure to check out their podcast once you get done with this episode. With that said, let's get back to JQA's life and career.
You may get a little excited when you shop at Burlington.
What a low price! You see that? They have my favorite brand! It's like a whole new Burlington! I can buy two! Woo!
I'm saving so much! Yeah!
Burlington saves you up to 60% off other retailers' prices every day. Will it be the low prices or the great brands? Burlington. Deals, brands. Wow. I told you so. Styles and selections vary by store.
Now, after surviving a couple of altercations with foreign vessels in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, which, of course, were going on during this time, their ship was forced to make a choice when they arrived in mid-October, when the waterways in that part of the world, as y'all know, began to freeze. Now, though Adams initially agreed for the ship to land at a German port recommended by the captain, when conditions improved, he insisted that they sail directly for the Russian port of Kronstadt, where they arrived on October 22nd. So they managed to make it through before everything froze. As described by Traub, quote, Adams found that life in St. Petersburg was like life in Berlin, but on an immensely grander and more opulent scale. A couple of factors worked in Adams's favor in order to ingratiate him to the Tsar. The two men were close in age, so we've got that going again. And he was definitely much closer in age than any other foreign diplomat in St. Petersburg. Also, Louisa had joined John Quincy to take up the post, whereas most diplomats had left their wives back at home. So this meant not only could John Quincy get close to Alexander, Louisa could get close to the Tsarina. And they form this foursome. They enjoyed the company of one another. Adams also got in some personal time with the Tsar during the winter when, while everyone else shut themselves indoors as much as possible, both Alexander and John Quincy kept up their respective habits of going around the city. So they're the only ones out when it's freezing cold walking around the city.
I'm with John Quincy on this. Like, yes, it can be really cold and dark around here, but yeah, can't just shut yourself in. You need to keep going and keep business running as usual. So good on John Quincy there.
And at this, it's not like they have a lot of great central heating and stuff. It's probably just as cold inside as it is outside.
Yeah, exactly.
You might as well be out walking around,
Well, and it also gave John Quincy an opportunity to be a tutor yet again because he tutored the Tsar in English.
Well.
Now, on December 31st, 1810, Adams would be able to claim a diplomatic victory as, after over a year of arguing with anyone who would listen, Tsar Alexander, quote, issued a ukase lifting all restrictions on exports from Russia and on imports coming by sea, while at the same time imposing a heavy tariff on goods arriving overland, most of which came from France. So at this point, the continental system had been set in place, and this was a big break from it that would be of great benefit to American merchants. Now, this change of policy can't be solely attributed to Adams, but doubtless his persistence and those long walks in the winter helped to move things along.
And from a Swedish perspective, this is super interesting because in 1809 is when Sweden lost Finland to Russia. So the Tsar isn't just sitting there. It's like, oh, I've got nothing better to do. I'll just chat with John Quincy. He's taken over a whole new country and loads of stuff that's going on.
Yeah, and it's only through some diplomatic negotiations on our point that we didn't lose more than just the Finnish side. There were actually Russian troops well into Sweden in what was a disastrous war for Sweden's sake. Perhaps so disastrous that that's why we haven't gone to war since, and credit ourselves for the longest peace in world history. Because don't fight Russia in the winter.
No, it does not work out well.
The Tsar goes walking in winter.
Yeah.
What's his army going to do?
Exactly. Now, 1811 brought an offer for a new office for Adams, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court.
I mean, the judiciary is the only bit he hasn't worked in yet, so why not?
Yeah,
why not?
Probably. He's just been a lawyer, so he might as well be work at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, he needs to be in all the bits of government.
Now, the reason this offer came, it apparently began in the previous year. His mother, Abigail Adams, wrote to President Madison asking him to bring her son home as he was suffering from financial strain in the expensive city of St. Petersburg. So his mom wrote, can't you just give him another job?
He's run out of money buying bearskin boots and thick coats because he has to go on walks with the Tsar in minus 25-degree winter.
Teach him English.
Exactly.
Doing the verb conjugations. Just bring him home.
What is debt in Russian?
So, this is a chance for him to get out. Vacancy came on the court. Madison was like, hey, he seems good enough. He'll be fine. He can sit on the Supreme Court. February 1811, he appointed him. Now, though the official notice of his appointment and confirmation would not reach John Quincy until July, he had already heard rumors of it, and in June, wrote a letter to Madison declining the nomination.
Before he actually got it, he's preemptively, I've heard that I might be offered this job, and just FYI, I don't want it.
I don't want it. Now, he explained that he was declining it to his brother Tom. He explained that, quote, I'm also and always shall be too much of a political partisan for a judge. So he's like, I think I'm going to stick with this politics thing. But, no. Now, to the president, he used the excuse of his wife's pregnancy, keeping them from traveling for many months, and his concern about having the seat vacant for too long. And as folks know from other episodes of the Madison series and seat at the table episodes, it actually stayed open for quite a while. So it was just, he didn't want to be shuffled off to the court. Louisa struggled with this decision because she wanted to be reunited with their sons, George and John. But with the pregnancy, she also had other things on her mind, because despite the difficulties that she experienced during this pregnancy, she did give birth to a baby girl in mid-August who John Quincy insisted on naming Louisa. So we're taking all the names that everybody else has and just recycling them.
Yeah, we see that in the early Swedish history where every queen is called Ingeborg or Ingegerd, and we're up to sort of like the 14th Eric and all these kind of stuff. And so, yeah, we need some new names. Yeah.
Now, new child, lots to be excited about, but John Quincy had heard the rumblings of war. He wrote back to his friends and acquaintances in the States, warning against a declaration of war with Britain. From the vantage point in Europe, Adams saw that France and Britain would ultimately destroy one another. And he knew that England was suffering from a grain shortage, which would make them more dependent on American imports and thus more amenable to a diplomatic resolution to their quarrels. He's like, look, the pressure's on, just hang on tight. Yeah, folks back in Washington didn't listen, and on June 18th, 1812, the U.S. declared war on Great Britain. Now, sadly for the Adamses, during this international crisis, they were also dealing with a personal crisis because young Louisa fell ill in late August 1812, and after doing all they could to engage with doctors and treat her symptoms, the 1-year-old passed away on the morning of September 15th. And it was a devastating loss for both John Quincy and Louisa.
Yeah.
That's so sad. Yeah.
Well, just forget everything else in that episode, just to do with them too as a couple. They've been through so much stuff.
Yeah. And it wasn't going to stop there because the Adamses were also following the news of the French invasion of Russia. So now they have to worry about the French army coming.
It's going to be winter. I return. Let me circle back to my previous argument. Don't invade Russia in the winter. It's going to be fine. Napoleon will never get to Moscow.
And apparently, walking around with the Tsar, Adams was confident. He's like, I think the Russians have this, because every other diplomat left St. Petersburg. The Adamses stayed. Now, like the American minister, Tsar Alexander was distressed about the war between the U.S. and Great Britain, concerned that it would distract the British from taking action against Napoleon. He's like, no, we need to take Napoleon out. Yeah. I don't care about this little conflict.
You need to go and have a battle in a Belgian town that a Swedish pop band can then write a winning Eurovision song about, like 150 years later. Waterloo really needs to happen, or ABBA will never be a thing. I bet that's what the Tsar said.
Exactly. And he was like, look, I will do whatever it takes. I'm willing to serve as a mediator between Britain and America. So just let's go ahead and resolve this. He's willing to mediate. In the first part of 1813, Louisa again sadly lost another child to miscarriage. And given her melancholy over the loss of her daughter the year prior, John Quincy was really worried over her health.
Yeah, go on.
But luckily in the spring, she began to emerge from understandable depression, so she's slowly but surely recovering. Now, in July 1813, Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin and former Senator James A. Bayard arrived in St. Petersburg with a new commission for Adams to serve with them on a 3-man commission to accept the Tsar's offer to mediate and negotiate with the British. But when they showed up, Adams had to inform them the British government had already refused the Tsar's offer. Glad you came all this way, but there's nothing to do. But the good news was that the British had offered to negotiate directly with the Americans, but they needed new instructions because their instructions clearly said Tsar mediating. So they had to wait for word from Washington.
Was the idea to get the Russians to mediate because they thought that's the only way that the British would actually enter in negotiations?
I think part of it was that they felt, and especially the war wasn't going great.
Yeah.
It was There had been a lot of losses on the American side. And so they were like, if we have the Tsar here, at least we've got somebody who kind of has our back. So, but the British were like, no, we don't need him involved. Let's just negotiate. So they waited for these new instructions, kept waiting. Finally, in January 1814, Bayard and Gallatin grew impatient, and they started making their way to London while Adams remained in St. Petersburg. Now, in March, Adams learned that Madison had approved direct negotiations with the British and had nominated Speaker of the House Henry Clay and U.S. Minister to Sweden Jonathan Russell to join the commission. They were all instructed to go to Sweden for the negotiations. Our next Swedish connection.
Excellent. Of course, you come here to find peace.
And so John Quincy traveled to Stockholm. He arrived, and he learned that the negotiations had been moved at the request of the British to Ghent, Belgium.
Oh, no. But he was looking forward to, maybe reconnecting with some people he knew here.
He's like, I really had a fun time last time. Can't we just negotiate here? Come on, I'll show you a few places.
Yeah, I've got my favorite bar just around the corner.
So he's like, okay, I'll go to Belgium. So he arrived in Ghent in late June, found Bayard and Clay already there. The others would arrive, and the British wouldn't get there until mid-August. So they were just kind of sitting around for a couple of months. Maybe they'll come at some point. But when the British arrived, they sent over their demands. Nothing was to change with the practice of impressment. The United States would have to hand over territory to the British. A buffer zone would have to be established in the West to protect the native allies of the British. American rights to fish off of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland would be revoked, and the Great Lakes would be demilitarized by the Americans. Basically, all of this was a big no for the Americans, but the British had just shown their cards. The Americans hadn't said what they were willing to negotiate. So for months, the two sides went back and forth, with the British commissioners sending every American statement of their stance back to London for comment from the government, which caused the negotiations to drag on. But finally, on December 25th, 1814, they had a draft treaty to sign, which was basically status quo antebellum. Let's just forget that all of this happened.
It's changed a fair bit from the original British proposition of we win to let's just pretend nothing happened.
Let's just go back to where we were. And John Quincy wrote to Louisa that, quote, the day on which I signed it, i.e. the treaty, was the happiest of my life, because it was the day on which I had my share in restoring the peace of the world.
Wow.
Which is nice, but then you also have to wonder, well, what about the day we were married? Wasn't that the happiest day of your life? Okay.
No. Our children being born. Yeah.
No. Peace. But as the commissioners were finishing up their work, John Quincy started to hear rumors that he was being appointed to another diplomatic post, that of U.S. Minister to Britain. So he sent word to Louisa to meet him in Paris. He left Ghent at the beginning of 1815, stopped off at Brussels before proceeding to Paris. He arrived in early February. Louisa, meanwhile, had left St. Petersburg on February 12th, bound west, but the reunion would take a little bit to bring into effect, because while Louisa traveled across war-torn Europe in the winter, news spread across the continent that Napoleon had escaped from Elba and was on his way back to Paris with an army. By March 20th, the French King Louis and his court had fled the capital, and the next day the emperor arrived. 2 days later, after having to face down imperial soldiers, Louisa finally arrived in Paris. So basically, Europe is being upended as she's just trying to get to Paris.
Yeah. Gosh, traveling through Europe with that alone in that time period was quite an undertaking. And then just considering the absolute upheaval on the continent with the Napoleonic War. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
Tough lady.
Yeah. But she made it. She made it safe. And on April 5th, official word reached Adams. He had been named as U.S. Minister to Britain. That wasn't just a rumor. And so they were able to travel to London for him to assume this new post. Now, they had instructed John and Abigail back home to send their sons, George and John, over And when they arrived in London on May 25th, their sons were already there. They were able to be reunited finally.
They were presumably hanging out at Buckingham Palace or something. Just waiting for them.
Just go and watch Parliament for a bit. Do what your dad did,
Just stay away from any of your granddad's creditors that's still around.
Tell them you don't know that guy.
Yeah.
And Adams quickly established a good working relationship with British Foreign Secretary Viscount Castlereagh, and the two would start to work through some of the remaining issues between their two nations following the war. By his first anniversary of serving in this diplomatic post, Adams had already negotiated a treaty calling for a joint demilitarization of the Great Lakes. It's like, we're willing to demilitarize if you are. Now, sadly, Adams would begin to suffer from a physical ailment that his father also experienced. Quote, rheumatism in his hands or an intense sensitivity in his eyes. And this would be something that he carries with him for the rest of his life. Now, while continuing to work on engaging diplomatically with the British, Adams started to hear rumors in late 1816 that Secretary of State James Monroe, who was the Democratic-Republican nominee and anticipated victor in the presidential election, was considering him to serve as Secretary of State in his administration. On March 6, 1817, now President Monroe wrote to Adams offering him the post. While Adams did not have a good opinion of Monroe, he still felt that it would be unwise to decline the offer. I mean, you're being offered Secretary of State, and quite a few Secretary of States have gone on to be president, so maybe I should accept this.
Yeah.
And he is actually an experienced diplomat.
Yes.
He is genuinely qualified for this.
He is genuinely qualified for this. So, thus, the Adamses wrapped up their business in London, and on June 10th, they departed, bound for the United States. Now, after such an extensive career and many years spent in foreign capitals, this would be John Quincy's last trip to Europe. And so, feels like, kind of the wrapping up of one phase of his life. And Trobe notes of Adams's life serving abroad that, quote, one of the peculiarities of John Quincy Adams's diplomatic career is that he rarely served in a hot spot. So you think about all the places that he was posted, they were kind of easy at that point. The roughest was London, but the war had been over. There was peace. So it was a bit better. But yeah.
I still think he should be credited for going on those winter walks in Moscow, though. That's the opposite of a hotspot. That's a freezing hotspot.
He can handle the cold.
Yes.
But the Adamses arrived in New York that summer, and after a brief stay, proceeded to Peacefield to visit with the Adams family. And with his two younger sons enrolled in school, John Quincy, accompanied by Louisa and their eldest son, George, proceeded to Washington. By September 22nd, John Quincy assumed his new post as head of the State Department. Now, the State Department that Adams took charge of was still settling into new offices following the burning of Washington that had destroyed their previous office. So this is still, the capital city is still recovering. And so they shared their new space with the War and Navy departments and occupied 5 rooms on the second floor and 4 additional rooms in the attic. This would be quite a different physical space for Adams than he had been used to with the offices of foreign ministers in European capitals. You can imagine that it was much more opulent, that they had much more space, and yeah, you've got some guys in the attic.
Yeah, when you've seen the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, coming back to a burnt out Washington where you have to share your rooms with other ministries, that's, not really the same.
No. He also had to cope with a pay cut to assume the post of Secretary of State, as the office only earned $3,500 a year when he started. Now, thankfully, the salary would be raised to $6,000 in 1819. But this was, even though it was a larger post in the government, it was still kind of a come down. But as some of his predecessors had done, Adams turned to his wife Louisa to help to further his career by hosting regular dinner parties and social events at their home on C and 4.5 Street. They usually held an informal open house every Tuesday evening with between 50 and 100 visitors in attendance. The Adamses also hosted dinners and occasionally a ball during the Christmas season. In January 1822, they held a party where they sent out 500 invitations. And even though, in modern terms that seems so small, this was a big deal. This was big in those times.
Yeah, and it's also them personally managing it. These days when ministers and prime ministers or in the presidents, they have staff that does that kind of event thing for them.
Yeah. They were having to arrange all of this. But it was a political advantage because President Monroe had cut back on social events at the president's house due to his wife's recurring bouts of illness. So people in Washington were looking for something to do. The Adamses were there to take that advantage. Traub notes of Adams's approach to his new office that, quote, his overall diplomatic goal was to maintain peace abroad in order to enable expansion at home. And that, quote, the questions that faced President Monroe and his Secretary of State had less to do with protecting the country than with increasing American influence and expanding American territory. But first, Adams had to deal with all the correspondence and dispatches that had piled up since his immediate predecessor, James Monroe, had left office to assume the presidency, and the office had only been administered on an interim basis. So he gets to the office, and the desk is completely full of letters that haven't been opened.
And I can't blame anyone because the person whose fault it is my boss.
I guess we'll let him have this one. But before long, Adams, quote, established a filing system for diplomatic correspondence, consular correspondence, and material from foreign ministries, as well as newspapers that the department received from across the nation. He also streamlined the process of drafting instructions for new diplomats being sent abroad by determining which parts of the instructions should be uniform so that more attention could be placed on those sections unique to the particular assignment. So he's like, guys, we just need a form letter. We can fill in some bits, but we just need a form letter.
Dear Prime Minister X, I greatly enjoyed receiving your Y. Look forward to seeing you in B.
Exactly.
Smart.
Now, given all the responsibilities that lived with the State Department, as we've seen in previous Seat at the Table episodes, efficiency was key in order to ensure that Adams and the few clerks at his disposal were able to meet their obligations. Now, Adams, along with the rest of the cabinet, will be called on to weigh in on the first major foreign policy issue faced by the Monroe administration in late October 1817. So, for years, Spain had faced revolts from its colonies in the Western Hemisphere, and the major European powers had rallied around Spain and its right to hold the colonies. And they're like, we don't want to lose our colonies either, so we're going to support you on this.
It's a European thing. We're Europe. We have the right to own other places.
Exactly. Thus far, the U.S. had maintained a policy of neutrality in the conflicts and had not recognized any of the independent Republican governments established in Spanish America, but the parallels to American independence were obvious. And so Monroe and his administration had to decide, how do we respond to this? Now, while Adams was sympathetic with the revolutionaries and felt that the president had the authority to shift from neutrality, he argued against doing so for the time being, as he didn't feel it to be prudent, given the example of the French Revolution, to point to how revolutionary governments could sometimes go awry. Let's just kind of see what happens before we say we're all in. Meanwhile, a group of revolutionaries had seized Amelia Island, which was an island under Spanish ownership right off the coast of Georgia and Florida, and were using it, quote, to launch privateering missions against Spanish shipping. Now, this was something that was seen this could potentially cause war. So Monroe asked his cabinet what should be done about it, and Adams advocated for using American military forces to force the privateers off, which the president agreed, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. But then the question shifted to whether the island should be handed back to the Spanish. I mean, it's almost the U.S., so why don't we just say it's the U.S.? And Adams and Secretary of War John C. Calhoun argued for retaining sovereignty over Amelia Island. But before long, this would not be the only part of Spanish Florida invaded by Americans. Because as a group of Seminoles, in response of being forced out of their village that they had established on the U.S. side of the border, attacked a supply convoy and murdered 40 folks in the convoy, including women and children, General Andrew Jackson was ordered to take a force to drive the Seminoles back in Spanish Florida. But Jackson decided, well, why don't we just go into Spanish Florida? Though his official instructions would expressly forbid him from attacking Spanish fortifications, though he was given leeway to cross the border, Jackson alluded to receiving unofficial word from the administration that he should just take Florida from the Spanish. And soon enough, he led an occupation of Pensacola. To add insult to injury, if invading a sovereign nation that we were not at war with wasn't enough, Jackson decided to get another nation into the mix because he captured 2 British citizens, accused them of conspiring with the Seminoles, and executed both of them.
Ooh.
Good job.
Escalated quickly.
It escalated quickly. And as you can imagine, the Spanish and the British were not too happy. Now, if they thought that when they lodged their protests with the State Department that they would find a sympathetic ear in Adams, they were mistaken. He actually agreed with Jackson's conduct and defended him in cabinet deliberations. In fact, he was Jackson's only defender, with even President Monroe feeling that the general needed to be rebuked in some form or fashion. Ultimately, Adams was able to get his colleagues to agree. Jackson would only face a reprimand. He wouldn't be removed. Just go ahead and say, bad, bad. Don't do that anymore. Pensacola would be returned to the Spanish. Everybody would be happy. So at least that crisis is over. Because Adams had other plans. Because in January 1818, he began to work more closely with Spanish minister to the U.S., Don Luis de Onís, in order to negotiate a deal to purchase Florida from the Spanish, even though, as Adams contended in a stance consistent with his predecessors, the Floridas were by right American by the Louisiana Purchase. So this went back to the Jefferson administration. They said, no, we already purchased that, but you're not leaving. You're insisting that it wasn't part of that purchase. Okay, we'll pay you some more money. Just let's go ahead and get this over with. But back and forth the negotiations went, and at one point, Adams demanded all of what is now the American Southwest north to the Missouri River. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, Adams had convinced President Monroe to send a warship to reclaim American sovereignty over the trading post of Astoria in the Oregon country. Now, while the British, who had seized that post during the War of 1812, objected, ultimately, they did not stop the Americans. They were like, it's one post in the middle of nowhere. If it's such a big deal to you, take it.
Yeah.
Sure. Monroe and Adams's plans for expansion had to be put on hold, however, as folks retreated from the Washington heat in the summer of 1818. Adams, of course, went home to Quincy for months before returning to the capital in mid-October. Now, sadly, soon after his return to Washington, he received the news that his mother's health was declining, and a few days after the fact, he learned that Abigail Adams had passed away on October 28th. In order to grieve, he spent a few days removed from official business, but when he returned, he re-engaged with negotiations with Onís. Onís had received strict parameters for the negotiations. Florida could be sold, but Texas and anything west of there was off of the table, so you're not getting the Southwest just yet. Adams continued to push for Western land cessions, but Monroe finally intervened and he said, just end this. We'll just take Florida.
Yeah.
Finally, in mid-February, they reached an agreement. The Spanish agreed to cede any territorial claims to lands in the west north of the 41st parallel, which they had not settled anyway, so they didn't really care. They're like, there's nothing up there that we want anyway. If it's such a big deal to you, sure, it's fine, it's yours. But more importantly, they ceded Florida.
And how many big cities or towns and things were there actually there at that point that were Spanish owned? Was there many places that they were interested in?
There was basically Pensacola and St. Augustine. That was about it. So there wasn't much, but part of what made Florida so attractive and folks focus so much attention on claiming Florida is because the government there was loose, and so they had the Seminoles there. They had, and unfortunately, for the American South, big concern was escaped enslaved people. People would flee there. The Spanish government had no desire to send them back. So it was seen as being kind of this outlaw area. But then also you look at it strategically, okay, that's a good place. That's a good position to be able to kind of know what's going on in the Caribbean. We're having to have ships sail around this place. So strategically, it makes sense to claim Florida.
Yeah, and it's a logical place to sort of fill in next on the map.
Exactly. And then they learned about the beaches. So
I was just going to say they needed real estate for a theme park hundreds of years down the line.
Exactly. So while engaged with this back and forth with Onís throughout 1818, Adams also worked closely with President Monroe to consider foreign diplomatic appointments. Now, both men realized that having denied Henry Clay the coveted post of Secretary of State, the administration needed to shore up its support in the West. The West was kind of a weak area for Monroe. So the administration in general, and Adams in particular, were aided at this time by the support of General Jackson, who in early 1819 faced a congressional inquiry into his conduct in Florida. Despising Clay and knowing that Adams had come to his support, from the moment the brash general and the refined secretary found themselves allies. So if Clay is kind of on the outs, hey, we've got Jackson. Jackson likes us. Jackson's popular in the West. Let's just get close to Jackson for a bit.
But you can see how those two, like you said, must have been quite different characters from what I know of Jackson. Yeah, kind of like hard-nosed, hard-drinking military man, and then this refined statesman that's lived predominantly in Europe. Yeah.
Not going to cause problems in a few years' time. Not at all. But Adams and his family returned to Massachusetts in August 1819, but the trip would be disrupted by the disappearance of his brother Thomas, who, like Charles had done decades earlier, had taken up heavy drinking and decided to leave his family due to his disgrace. Now, naturally, as the big brother, it was up to John Quincy to deal with Tom, take charge of his financial situation, and bring about a reconciliation between him and their father. So he's not only having to do diplomacy abroad, but at home as well.
But so the guy actually, you said disappeared. Did he actually disappear?
He basically left the family and they didn't know where he was. Yeah.
Wow.
And so John Quincy had to hunt him down, bring him back. Okay, let's go ahead and sort things out.
Wow, he really lives up to the kind of big brother stereotype in the family.
Absolutely. So, with that settled, upon his return to Washington, Adams led the State Department in a move to new offices in the recently constructed Northeast Executive Building. So they could finally spread out a little bit. State would have, quote, 11 of the 15 rooms on the second floor and 6 more in the attic. So we're not getting rid of the attic, folks, but they've got a little more space.
That's good because he's got this new filing system that you were talking about. That needs a couple of rooms.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, while getting settled into these new offices, Adams and indeed the entire nation would be faced with a problem that threatened to rend the family of American states asunder. Now, up until this point, Adams had been comfortable with holding contradictory viewpoints. Because while seeing slavery as an evil, he also felt that slaveholding states were within their rights to continue the practice. Unlike many of the contemporary leaders of the time, he did not support the work of the American Colonization Society to free enslaved individuals and resettle them in Africa because he saw it as harmful to free Black individuals. As noted by Traub, quote, Adams had long understood slavery as a moral blot, but not a political issue. The question did not really command his attention until the debate over the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Then he saw, as if by lightning flash, that the compromise between slave and free states that had kept the Union whole was morally corrupt and politically unsustainable. As Secretary of State, Adams stood apart from the debate. So, though he couldn't join in the public debate about it, he did speak his mind in cabinet deliberations, including a particularly tense meeting on March 3rd, 1820, where he countered an argument being made by Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford by asserting that, quote, the Declaration of Independence not only asserts the natural equality of all men and their unalienable right to liberty, but that the only just powers of government are derived from the consent of the governed. A power for one part of the people to make slaves of the other can never be derived from the consent and is therefore not a just power. And as the year went on, Adams became ever more confident in his anti-slavery stance, going to the point of saying of the rights of free blacks that, quote, I would defend them should the dissolution of the Union be the consequence.
Yeah, he's going from being a bit, I'm not sure, moral, not political, to going all in.
Yeah. He's like, this is an issue. It is destroying us. We have to deal with this, and there's only one way to deal with this. Now, meanwhile, after considerable delay, in the latter half of 1820, the Spanish government finally approved the Adams-Onis Treaty, and Monroe appointed Andrew Jackson as the first territorial governor of Florida. So Adams's great work in gaining control of Florida was finally complete. However, it was clear that for Adams, this was not the end of American expansion. As he stated in a cabinet meeting in November 1819, quote, that the world should be familiarized with the idea of considering our proper dominion to be the continent of North America. He's like, we just secured this little part of it. Let's see what we can do about the rest of it.
You know what I said about coloring in the map? I got my pen ready.
I'm ready. 1820 would also see John Quincy buy a home in Washington, D.C., a large brownstone at 224 F Street. This would become the Adamses' new venue for their nightly dinners and balls while Congress was in session. Beyond just for socializing, they could use the larger space as, in addition to their own children, John Quincy and Louisa had taken in the 3 orphan children of Louisa's sister, as well as another of Louisa's relatives, and occasionally they would take in John Quincy's niece by his late sister Nabby and his brother Tom's 4 children.
Wow, they really ran a large household.
Yeah, there are a lot of children running around while John Quincy is coloring in the map and probably learning a new language at the same time.
And all the kids is like, you're running around and you're screaming. The volume is fine, but it's not in ancient Greek.
I want to know how many of these children he employed as his secretaries.
I mean, he's got to get them ready, right?
Yeah. One of them's going to go off to listen to the English Parliament soon.
Now, with his work at the State Department in 1820 and 1821, John Quincy was consumed with seeing to the publication of various reports and papers, including a report of weights and measures, the census, a digest of commercial law, and the annals of the Constitutional Convention. So he's got a lot going on.
But why is that on him, the State Department? This seems like domestic.
So it's funny, the State Department at that time was kind of the catch-all for stuff that nobody else wanted to do, but needed to be done. So sure, the State Department can do that.
I didn't know that. That's funny. So I thought it was just foreign affairs, but they also have to do, measurements and census. All right.
Now, to be fair, Jefferson kind of started that as the first Secretary of State because Jefferson was interested in everything, but some of his successors were not so keen on weights and measures. John Quincy Adams, though, he was like, okay, I can handle this.
Feels like something for the Treasury.
I know, right?
Probably got one of his kids to deal with it, to be fair.
You look like you could be a good secretary. What age are you? 12? Oh, yeah, you're coming with me. In 1821, Adams was asked to deliver the annual 4th of July oration at the U.S. Capitol, which was typically kind of a pro forma patriotic address, virtues of independence, United States, rah, rah, rah. Instead, he decided to use it as an opportunity to answer charges that he was an Anglophile by vilifying Britain, as well as colonialism in general, before turning to a defense of the Monroe administration's policy of non-interference in the South American independence movement. So he's like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to do my own thing. Now, the Monroe administration also had to deal with an unusual situation. American citizens and leaders in support of American intervention abroad. So before now, America and Americans in general had typically been, let's just kind of do our own thing.
Mm.
But now you have these independence movements that are happening. Greece had declared its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1821 and had reached out to the American government and people. Hey, we're declaring independence. Y'all declared independence. Why don't we do something?
Yeah.
The cabinet finally debated the issue in August 1823, and though most of the administration was in favor of intervention, Adams argued against it. It's like, we still haven't colored in the map. We need to focus on that.
And Greece is a lot further away than sort of, North and Southern America.
Yes. Meanwhile, in September 1821, Russian Tsar Alexander, quote, renewed the privileges and the exclusive trading rights of the so-called Russian-American Trading Company, which gave them rights from 160 miles north of the current U.S.-Canadian border on up to modern-day Alaska. However, in this renewal was added a provision which, quote, banned all foreign ships from 100 miles of the claimed coastline. So both Britain and the U.S. had problems with this on the grounds that it violated the terms of their negotiated Treaty of 1818, and so negotiations on this would carry on for years. But if you're going to have all of North America, Alaska's part of that. So really starting to look at the larger picture. Meanwhile, in March 1822, President Monroe recognized the governments of Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata and appointed ministers, so Adams spent that spring drafting instructions for these new diplomatic posts. 1822 would also see the race to succeed Monroe as president heat up, as Speaker of the House Henry Clay schemed to make Adams look bad by having one of his associates in Congress request correspondence from the negotiations in Ghent. Now, due to Adams's diligence in gathering up all the correspondence, ultimately, he was able to turn the tables on Clay's plans. It's like, oh, I'll give you everything. Just, here you go. Let's see what Henry Clay was doing, too.
Finally, having a structured filing system and diary keeping pays off.
It pays off. Now, Clay would disavow his involvement with this matter in a piece published in the National Intelligencer in November, but he was fooling no one. As described by Traub, quote, Adams had fought a newspaper war and won hands down. He had vindicated his honor and at the same time greatly raised his standing in the court of public opinion. He had utterly silenced his critics and dismayed Henry Clay. 1822 also saw the administration consider whether to work towards annexing Cuba. Now, while there were some folks in the administration, including Secretary of War Calhoun, who were in favor of taking Cuba, Adams, though he was amenable to the idea, was against the idea of an active interventionist policy. And ultimately, Adams won out in the debate in the administration. He's like, look at the map. We've still got other stuff on the mainland to claim, so let's focus on that. In 1823, the family would be scandalized when John Quincy's son, John Adams II, was kicked out of Harvard in his senior year for participating in a student riot after the arrest of another senior. Despite his father's intervention, the president of Harvard refused to let young John graduate. It's like, it's not making me look good, son. Please don't riot.
Do we know what they were rioting about? You said a student had been kicked out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what was the circumstance? Do we know?
I don't know. It didn't really mention too much in details. I'm sure it's out there, but it's interesting. Like, I've read so many accounts of colleges at the time that, something would happen. One student would get kicked out for whatever reason, and folks would just riot. It was quite an interesting time to be a college student.
Yeah, I feel like I missed something. We had no riots at my university. And I had a sword at university. I feel like I missed an opportunity.
You were ready.
Rioting. Yeah. I was on the fencing team. I could have rioted Loads. Oh, I was just thinking he could have been rioting for good reasons and been unfairly treated.
Possibly. But yeah, the Harvard president was like, no, I have a no rioting policy. No.
Regardless of the reason behind it.
No. Still, Adams had work to do. He returned to Washington in mid-October, and on November 7th, Monroe hosted the first of a series of cabinet meetings to discuss his upcoming annual message and how recent diplomatic developments should play into it. So first, there was an offer from Britain to issue a joint statement expressing their opposition to Spain or any other European power attempting to reclaim the revolutionary states of Latin America. Now, though Britain had not followed the U.S.'s lead in recognizing the new governments, they also didn't want to see any other European competitors claiming or reclaiming territory in North America.
So Britain was very like, we support independence, just not when it's independence from us.
Exactly.
Canada's still going to be a dominion or a colony, but, the people getting independence from Spain, all for it. Sounds classic British politics to me.
I know, right? But also, word had come from the Russian Tsar that he would not recognize the new Republican governments of Latin America, which suggested that he may be considering proposals put forward by some of their partners in the Holy Alliance to take over those former colonies and impose European monarchs on them. So it seems like from Europe, there is a lot going on and about to be some potentially bad things for the U.S. So Adams approached Monroe about the idea to outline, quote, a coherent doctrine of American interest in the upcoming annual message, and then spent a week working on a draft, which he then shared with Monroe. The two worked with the cabinet to integrate Adams's notes into the larger message, which dealt specifically with developments in both Europe and North America. As they worked on this message, Adams also had to help cool tempers in the administration in response to new intelligence and messages from the Holy Alliance, which stoked fears that European powers would soon retake the newly independent states in Latin America. Adams exerted his influence to dissuade the president and other cabinet members from supporting the idea of an alliance with Britain. He's like, let's don't be hasty. George Washington warned us against alliances. Let's consider this. And so, though they would go back and forth, when Monroe sent his annual message to Congress, as described by Trobe, quote, Monroe adopted Adams's positions on all the questions in which the two had differed, or where Adams held more decisive views. The ideas expressed in this message, including that the United States, quote, should consider any attempt on their, i.e., European powers, part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. These ideas are what's now known as the Monroe Doctrine.
It should be John Quincy Adams' doctrine.
Exactly. Again, he's like, I guess you can have this one.
Boss.
You're the president, so you have to stick your name on it. Yeah.
As noted by Trobe, though Monroe used the opportunity to, quote, formalize a growing national consensus, what Adams contributed to the effort, quote, was its astringency. Left to his own devices, Monroe would have offered a more idealistic vision of the American role as a force for the global advancement of republicanism. Adams blunted that with his dogged insistence that American policy serve American interest. So he's like, we need to be forceful about this. Now, after the president's message to Congress was delivered, Adams took it upon himself to extend a dinner invitation, as well as an invitation to a ball that he was holding, to the new senator from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson. Now, though it was already known that Jackson was planning to be Adams's rival for the presidency, which we'll get to in a moment, Trobe asserts that Adams genuinely admired Jackson at this point and admitted that he would support Jackson for the presidency if he was knocked out of contention. Yeah, we'll see how that plays out.
How that goes.
Because as 1824 got underway, more and more of the discussion in political circles was about the presidential election. As noted by Trobe, as 6 of the 24 states still had the state legislature choose their presidential electors, including the most populous state, New York, quote, a presidential race was not a popularity contest. A candidate succeeded by appealing to other professional politicians as much as to ordinary citizens. Now, this appeal had to be subtle, not blunt, because open campaigning by presidential candidates was seen as a no-no.
Yeah.
The candidates' campaign managers and supporters would be the ones actually making the appeals. And in this case, as the year began, there were 5 major candidates. So, of course, Adams, Secretary of the Treasury Crawford, Secretary of War Calhoun, Speaker of the House Clay, and Senator Andrew Jackson. Jackson was seen as being as more of the wild card because he was an anti-establishment populist candidate, which is something that hadn't really been seen in U.S. presidential politics to this point. While Calhoun was seen by many, including President Monroe, as being quite capable, he was also seen as being very young at the age of 42. But we'll talk more about his candidacy in his episode because he's not going to last long. Crawford, as we discussed in his episode, was initially seen as the front runner, despite having suffered a debilitating stroke in 1823. So despite that, he was still the favorite of the establishment, including former President Jefferson, and he had this young, up-and-coming politico named Martin Van Buren, who was leading his campaign efforts. But Crawford and his supporters would face a strong challenge to the caucus system, which to this point had been used to nominate the party's choice for president. With this one-party system ostensibly in place and 4 other challengers to the presidency, Democratic-Republican members of Congress were not ready to just anoint Crawford as the new president. And so a vast majority of them stayed home rather than attend the caucus. I told you Calhoun wasn't going to be around long. He dropped his run for the presidency after he overwhelmingly lost the nomination of the Pennsylvania State Convention on March 8th to Jackson. He couldn't see a path to victory without Pennsylvania, so he decided, I'll be vice president. And spoiler alert, he became the next vice president. Clay, meanwhile, was delivering speeches on his favorite topics of what could be dubbed his platform, which were, quote, the tariff, internal improvements, and the South American patriots. But as with Calhoun, we'll focus more on Clay's run in his seat at the table episode. So getting back to Adams, because he's in the mix too. As described by Trobe, quote, if not running, then at least unmistakably, Adams was standing.
So then he might start walking and then he'll be running.
Walking, it's winter. I'm walking. But he was uncomfortable playing the political game. As much as he allowed himself to do so, it was because he was ambitious for the presidency. Again, from Trobe, quote, he wanted it, but he did not want to want it. But he's still Secretary of State, so he's still got stuff to do. You can't completely be focused on the election.
Stuff needs to be filed.
Yes,
Measurements need to be agreed on. Measured, yeah.
So on March 13th, 1824, the U.S. and Britain signed a treaty drawing largely from language drafted by Adams, which, in response to a resolution from the House of Representatives, sought the, quote, abolition of the African slave trade in a concerted joint effort by the 2 nations, which would brand any of their respective citizens engaged in such trade as, quote-unquote, pirates and treat them as such. But when the final treaty came back from the Senate for approval, enslavers in that body objected to the treaty both in general and particularly to an article that would allow British ships to seize ships suspected of engaging in the illegal trade off the American coast. They're like, that's a step too far. But when they sent back a confirmed treaty with that article exempted, the British felt that it was unacceptable for America to exempt itself from the enforcement, and thus that treaty went away. But he did at least try to negotiate a treaty to end the slave trade from Africa. 1824 did at least see Adams claim victory in negotiations with the Russians to protect the interests of U.S. merchant ships and fur traders in the Pacific Northwest, in spite of the expansive grant to the Russian-American Company given by the Russian Tsar in 1821. So, with all that done, Adams returned to Quincy in early September to visit with his father. Former Secretary of War Henry Dearborn visited the Secretary of State to extend an invitation to a public dinner in Boston in his honor, but Adams declined the invitation. He was like, that may look like I'm campaigning, so maybe I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But he would travel to Philadelphia to greet the visiting General Lafayette, who was on his farewell tour through the U.S., before returning to Washington in mid-October to await the election results.
Did he get a T-shirt like Lafayette farewell tour?
1821, yeah.
He should have.
Yeah.
I'm sure he got the official T-shirt.
Yeah.
So at the time, elections, of course, they didn't know there was no one day for the election, so they just had to wait for news to come in, trickling in piecemeal. But it soon became clear that Jackson was the only candidate winning in various regions. Clay had won a handful of states in the West, Crawford had won a handful in the South, Adams had won a handful in the Northeast, but Jackson came in first. He came in first in the popular vote, then Adams, Clay, and Crawford. But the electoral vote was really what mattered, and there too, he came in first with 99 electoral votes, followed by Adams with 84, Crawford taking third with 41, and Clay fourth at 37. So, knowing that Crawford was not likely to win, and that the race was really down to the top two, because at this point, where none of the four candidates had gotten a majority of the electoral votes, it would then go to the House of Representatives for them to choose from the top three. So Clay's out. Crawford is not likely to win. Everybody knows he's still suffering from health issues. So it's down to Jackson and Adams.
Mm.
Jackson's supporters started promoting the idea that Adams withdraw from the race. So you remember that time that you said if you were knocked out, you'd support Jackson? Can we do that? But Adams felt that as they were following constitutional policy, he was just as entitled as Jackson to have his name in contention. I mean, that's what it says in the Constitution.
Yeah, and he's not knocked out. He's just currently losing.
Yeah.
Exactly. But he wasn't comfortable with playing the political game before. But now he was not just going to sit back and wait to see what happens.
Because, when you know that, you don't get offered these opportunities very often.
Exactly.
I mean, to be fair, it's just one thing to say that you're not interested in playing the game when you're not playing it. But then when you're not just playing it, but there's actually a chance that you might win it, then I think most of us would play the game.
Yeah. And so he did.
Yeah.
And Trobe notes that out of character, Adams, quote, went around to the rooming houses where almost all members of Congress stayed during the session. So he's going around, he's visiting, he's trying to rally votes. But the big fish was Henry Clay. He still was Speaker of the House, and so he still wielded a great influence. Now, Jackson also paid a call to Clay as well, but ideologically speaking and personality-wise, they were like oil and water.
Mm.
So there was little doubt that Adams would end up being Clay's pick, but this opened up a can of worms for both Adams and Clay. Because just as it was likely that Clay would support Adams regardless, likewise, Clay was always going to end up as one of Adams's top picks for the cabinet. But the fact that Clay was offered the position of Secretary of State, that same position that the last three presidents had held at one point prior to assuming office as chief executive, tongue started to wag about, was this a corrupt bargain?
Mm.
Was this a deal?
Mm.
But on February 9th, the electoral votes were officially counted, revealed that John C. Calhoun had been elected vice president. There was no contest there. But, of course, still had to decide the presidential race. And on the first ballot, Adams won the presidency with 13 votes to 7 votes for Jackson and 4 for Crawford, because the states had to vote, as one contingent.
Mm.
So you had to win each state. So Adams won the presidency with 13 votes. President Monroe hosted a gathering that evening attended by the president-elect, along with Senator Jackson, Secretary of War Calhoun, Speaker of the House Clay, Representative Daniel Webster, General Lafayette, and others. Jackson made a point of shaking Adams's hand publicly, but as noted by Trobe, quote, this courteous encounter will be one of the very last between the two men.
And he kicked his chin at the same time.
I wish you the best. Break a leg.
And it's interesting how some of the elections have been essentially unanimous. There's a few that have been extremely close, and a few people say, "Oh, I don't want Washington to like lose his record as being the only unanimous person and stuff." And then there are some that are ridiculously competitive, and it swings backwards and forth between these two.
Exactly. And it's just it's so, and you know, I can only imagine the tension in that room that night. It's like everybody else wanted to be president in this room. But as we wrap up Adams' tenure in the cabinet, I think it's important to note that, as described by Noble Cunningham, quote, Monroe gave great support to his capable Secretary of State, yet Adams frequently modified his own position after hearing the president's views. The two really enjoyed an excellent partnership from which both men grew. But now, John Quincy Adams is the president. We'll leave John Quincy there for now, and I hope that you'll return for the final episode where we'll finish JQA's life and evaluate his career. Until then, once you get done with this episode, please be sure to check out A Flat Pack History of Sweden and Kingdom wherever you get your podcast. I'll have a link to learn more about Ilsa and Chris's podcast on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find sources used for this episode, past episodes of the podcast, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the podcast. If you are so inclined, you can join our patrons who, for as little as $1 a month, help to offset the cost for producing and distributing the podcast, as well as getting access to all the research resources needed for this deep dive into presidential history. Special thanks to our newest patron, Andy, for joining Team Presidencies. Andy found his way to the Presidencies podcast through our friends Rob and Jamie over at Totalis Rankium and wanted to help keep this work moving forward. I cannot thank Andy and all of our patrons enough for their support. Andy has also helped support the podcast by sending books from my research wish list. If you'd like to provide one-time support, that's a great way to do so. And that list can be found on the website, presidenciespodcast.com. The quickest and easiest way to help support the podcast is to take a moment to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else that has that capability. It may seem like a small thing, but it really helps in getting the podcast noticed so that folks can learn why they too should be listening to Presidencies. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow me on social media if you don't already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads at Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.